You're live.
Okay, we are live. This is conference committee on H.454 on June 12th. So I know everybody's been working. We started a little bit late this morning just to do a little more work on some language with legislative council. So we have it just to get the thing started. We have passed out or had, they can pass out language that does two things, two separate concepts of, one is to add language, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, on intent language. And the first sentence, I suppose, in some ways is the key sentence. It's further the intent of the General Assembly to ensure the imposition of the new statewide education tax rate contemplated by this act does not result in an increase in education property tax bills relative to Vermont's current education funding system for municipalities across Vermont. And then just a little bit of the ways in which that will come to pass. So I'm not going to read the whole thing.
Can we have a brief moment of silence while we read it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is this entirely, it's new, not replacing?
I think it's all new.
Okay.
Yeah. What's in yellow is saying, yeah.
Okay, it's not it's not striking the other parts of this fairly endless. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
So this is additional, not.
Yes.
Thanks.
We're good to.
I'm good to talk about the next section. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So the next section has to do with tuition. And we had the discussion yesterday about tuition. We started off, at one point we were talking about weights, then we're talking about tuition. So what we are coming back with is the notion that receiving schools, be they public or independent, that can charge tuition of up to 110% of the base amount. And then if it's a CTE, comprehensive CTE, that is an independent school, because the public CTEs, there's no change under what's being proposed. The only change would be for the independent CTEs. And this is just to ensure that they can charge up to 120% total, 10% for the high school weight and 10% for the CTE weight. And so one of the beauties of this is that it's got no statewide impact. It's only impact within the district where the schools are. So that's the proposal.
The 0.1, why, I guess, that over another number? the 0.1 that you have selected as for both CTE and grades 9 through 12.
They're probably both downward. But the allowable tuition rate now would indicate a 12.5% differential for high school. We just went with a 0.1. That's what we had done from the start. Just figured it's close enough, a little bit low, close enough. And I think Scott, what you talked
Yeah,
about.
I mean, we looked at what in the bill at one time, there was an FTE, CTE weight of 1. Mathematically, that came out to about a 0.14. So we just rounded down to 0.1. It's fine. We can make it work with that.
In this construct, how does the district consent to it? Like, what's the legal mechanism for a district to consent to that price?
The district wouldn't consent. The receiving school, public or independent school, would notify the district of what amount up to 10% of the base that they're assigning. So they might say they don't need any. They might say it's fine. They might say we need 2%, 8%, whatever. They would be the ones, they would assign the amount.
I've been thinking about where there are other places in law that government doesn't consent or even set the price that they're willing to pay, like Medicaid. There are specific rates that are set for hospitals, even though hospitals have a longstanding, integrated relationship with their community. And I'm wondering if you have, I'm just trying to find any other parallels to the law to hang my hat on as I think through this stuff. And
in a way, you can hang it on 110%. Because the only difference here, you could just say 110% shall pay, except it's giving the option for the independent schools who work with their communities and have for 200 years to do less if that's what's needed to make the system work. Otherwise, you could just say 110%.
And in a non-operating district, if
Are you speaking of a district that doesn't operate any public schools?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in a district that doesn't operate any public schools, let's say the way the new districts line up, we wind up with a couple, a Northshire district that doesn't operate any schools. And in that construct, the supplemental district, we're sort of, 15 years out from the transition. The supplemental district spending cap is at 5%. How would that district be able to pay the 10%?
Or 20%.
20%, yes, or 20%.
Well, I mean, I think that's where
Tuition.
the receiving schools are going to have to work with their districts, just like they always have. I mean, there's always a maximum amount that a district can pay or the voters will approve, and they work with their districts to set a rate that works for those districts.
So the thing about this is the way it's always worked.
I know, but nothing else in the bill is the way it's always worked. Everything else in the bill is a new way to work, right? So I'm trying to be okay, everything else is capped. What's a worst case scenario? Are we preparing for that? What happens if a district can't raise enough money under law to pay for this fee that's being set by a private provider?
Well, I think it all fits because remember, in that non-operating district, probably, just 30%, only 30% of their students are 9 through 12.
Okay.
Right. So we're not talking about their whole student body. We're only talking about this 9 through 12 population, which is, 30% of up to 10%, which is 3%. They've got, supplemental of 5. So I think the math will all work out in there. Now, if they had all high school students, that would be a little different, but we don't really have any districts we won't have any districts that are just a school student.
So in that scenario where it's non-operating and it's elementary schools, would the elementary schools, the private elementary schools, then be agreeing to take less than the base amount in order to compensate?
No, this provision would only be for the 9 through 12 population. So
Yeah.
your pre-K through 8 population would be base and weights and,
But then where does the extra money come from?
oh, well, it basically comes from the same as in a fully operating district where there's a decision made within the district to steer more money to secondary or CTE. In this case, the same thing would happen. The district would steer a little bit more money to secondary or CTE. And then it's either a dollar that, either take that dollar out of their operating budget or they ask for supplemental spending to cover it, which is really no different than it works right now. Right now, any receiving school, when they ask for a dollar from a sending district, that dollar either comes out of their budget or it comes out of a taxpayer's pocket. It's really no different than it would be here right now.
I'm not sure, you're understanding my question,
I
maybe?
think it really comes down to whether you believe it costs more to run a high school or you don't.
But,
So I think the
okay, no,
question
that's
here
not,
is
that's not the
really-
question. Like, it's really totally mechanical. So if it's a fully non-operating district, the non-operating elementary schools are charging the base weight tuition as we've sort of set, right?
Yeah.
And the money's following the student. And then the high school in the non-operating district is charging an extra 20%. Where does that money come from
Because you
for
don't
the
have the
district to
ability
pay the
to
high school? Because
move
you
it.
won't be able to shift it in the non-operating district.
It would, I mean, unless they have grant funds to cover that, whatever costs they have, then they would probably, if there's extra monies there, they would have to go to supplemental.
But if the supplemental is set at 5%, like, would it be?
Or if the voters vote no on supplemental too.
Well, that could happen now. A district could vote no on a budget now, and as part of the process of trying to get to a budget where the voters would vote yes, there would probably be conversations with receiving schools. If they're a totally non-operating district, they would have those conversations. That's
So
what
do
happened.
you imagine the independent elementary schools would then be charging less than the base and the weights? As part of that partnership?
No, that's not the way the bill's constructed right now.
I know.
Um,
Okay. I feel like I need a diagram, but I don't.
Do you foresee, and I guess I don't see anything in the bill, so the answer to this is probably no,
yeah.
but any kind of oversight to check to see if that additional charge is justified?
Nothing to suggest that. What this will result in, I believe, for both the independent high schools and the independent high schools with the CTE is less money than now. And I think they are running very efficient operations now. And the problem here is that they can't run one, they have to get paid.
Mhm.
They have to get paid what it actually costs to run high school. And under the current, without this, that's not happening. So this is an attempt to, within the district, just the way that happens now, maintain the ability for the independent high schools to survive.
Yeah, this is in lieu of setting away.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it's not just independent. I mean, it's receiving schools.
Mhm.
I mean, there are a number, just in my area, a
Yeah.
number of public receiving schools that receive public high school students that are charging far more than what the independent schools are charging. So there's a loss for them, an even bigger loss actually on a student basis than what the independent schools are looking at.
Well, I think in significantly larger districts, that would that entire scenario, somewhat goes out the window, but I appreciate that. My mechanical questions about it are exactly the same in that scenario.
The concern is, once we ratchet down to being able to do 5% above the base.
Mhm.
But if your entire high school is being sent somewhere else, and they're charging 10% above the base, where does the extra 5% come from?
Yeah. Thanks. Do you have any other questions about this?
Well, I guess, I'm still a believer that CTE is a next year issue because, the independent schools like St. J and LI that run CTE centers are not the only ones with big questions about how it's funded.
Mhm.
And I think that, it's complicated because we've got so many different systems of delivering CTE, and between independently standing CTEs and those that are parts of high schools and those that are part of comprehensive independent schools. I'd rather see, frankly, a comprehensive solution to how we're going to fund CTE adequately.
I would as well. But however, right now, the way this bill is drafted and with current law, there is a mechanism for public CTEs to get paid through a tuition setting mechanism. There is not for independent school CTEs. And that's all we're looking for, is a mechanism for those schools to know that they're going to have the resources to provide CTE services for their kids, which public CTEs have. And we're not trying to,
What is the public CTE
Yeah.
mechanism in the bill? Because
Yeah.
I don't.
well, there is nothing in the bill, which is,
Yeah.
its current law is they have a tuition setting mechanism with SBE so that they have the resources they need to run those CTE centers. There is traditionally, up until this point, the two independent CTEs have received those resources
Mhm.
through tuition setting. If we're going to take away their tuition setting and not provide a mechanism for the resources for CTEs to get to those schools, they're in a situation where there are no resources to run that CTE. This would provide those
And that's not
resources.
true of the publics.
I think it's crucially important that we figure out how CTE centers get paid for CTE services. There's nothing thus far in this process that has even begun to try to comprehend that,
That is true. But
including how to finance them.
the way that the independent CTs are financed has been removed. And
Okay,
that's not true for the public.
Okay.
CT. And I'm not trying to remove the public CTs.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that absent a statewide plan that says how we're going to have CTEs.
this is a safety valve.
This would ensure that if nothing happens, that those kids that take CTEs at those two schools would still have the resources they need for CTE. I would welcome a statewide solution.
And adopting this doesn't in any way make it harder for the statewide solution next year or the year after. There's nothing here that makes it harder.
I mean, I think it cements some vested interests, but we'll have enough vested interests regardless.
But the vested interest getting paid to run a CTE,
Yeah.
that's a vested interest. Well, okay.
I think we understood the problem you were trying to solve, and worked on a little bit of language ourselves, thank you. Yeah, that'd be great. To just try to be more explicit about where we saw some of the solutions already coming from. Thank you. And so sort of towards that question of whether or not it costs more to educate secondary students, which feels like the conversation has narrowed somewhat to a matter of faith. Just wanted to add more definition to how we want to study that in order to meet some of your concerns. And so that's on page 3. And then also wanted to point out, if you go to the very end of this, the effective dates, on page 8, subsection F. And this was existing in the bill, but it certainly, I don't know if, I certainly haven't read the effective dates very carefully in a little while, so I just wanted to bring your attention to it. There's a contingent language here, that essentially none of this happens. The foundational formula doesn't happen at all unless and until we receive these comprehensive recommendations and are able to act on them. And so I just wanted to make sure that you knew that that was there. Okay, great. And then the second piece that we just wanted to share with you is, after a bunch of conversations with you all and with the tax department, to narrow the property tax classifications. So that what was, so that we're left with a homestead residential, a non-homestead residential, and then a non-homestead non-residential. The non-homestead non-residential is essentially like all of what was commercial before and all what was rental property before, into one category. That's sort of, it's been calling it, shouldn't you just call that everything else? So that's what that is. So to make it much more easy to administer and to address some of existing concerns about whether or not commercial properties might experience some access from this. So to be more explicit about the goals there.
In your study, right,
Mhm.
page 3.
Yeah.
It says whether it costs more to educate a secondary student than an elementary student in Vermont, and if so, in the appropriate weights. And then, but it doesn't, the issue that we've been talking about is not all secondary students, but if you don't run a full district and all you run is a secondary school,
Mhm.
does
that cost more?
that cost more? Is there a difference?
But it wasn't about, it was really about the cost of of educating secondary students, and more the ability about being able to shift funding upward from the lower grades that you had raised as something. So we had the same conversation, went around in a circle, and came back to, we're talking about the cost of educating a secondary student. Yeah.
So then I'll just say that study could happen. We cannot go back to our districts and say, taking away your ability to get paid, but don't worry, future legislature is going to fix it. We can't do that. There's no, in our minds, so you can debate this or not, no question it costs at least 10% more to run high school. And if study after study shows it and we can later come to some agreement, fine. But in the meantime, we've got to have the safety valve in there, to use that terminology, for those schools to get paid for the cost of run high school, and a very, very efficient high schools, I will add.
Okay.
So I don't know how to get around that. We have to come out. We gotta get.
I'm struggling to get around it myself because we had studies that said it didn't. APA's work, Professor Colby's team's work, both said it didn't. And so we were trying to, and if we think about sort of like hospital rate setting studies or like anything like as a legislator, I feel at a loss if I'm not sort of following the math that's put before me by the team. And so I'm just trying to find my way towards that. I really do understand where you're coming from. I'm just struggling to get where you are.
I mean, the APA in order for that to be effective, required big, large districts in an entirely different construct. The weights that came from the cost basis model just haven't been peer reviewed. It's one person's work.
You can say the same thing about the APA.
But we know what it costs to run high schools, and the actual cost of 12.5% is pretty compelling.
Do you want to say something about your?
So,
All right, well, I mean, we are not surprisingly at a challenging point here. You've reached a sort of, there's no way, and we have been moving and trying to address these concerns. Probably the best thing we do now is each take what we have here and spend some time, and then maybe should have a goal of reconvening at